November 1991. Samdech is returning to Phnom Penh. The demigod, the king, the prince, the president, the prime minister, the exile, the prisoner, the filmmaker, the musician, Norodom Sihanouk, the man who for more than 50 years personified Cambodia. After using and abusing all of his lives, he could not prevent the prophecy from being fulfilled.
Les Cambodgiens, ils savent une chose, nous avions notre Nostradamus, il avait prédit cela. Il disait que les 2500e année du bouddhisme, le Cambodge connaîtrait des villes sans habitants. Des rues sans passants. Et puis connaîtrait une guerre très longue dont le sang coulerait jusqu'à atteindre le ventre des éléphants. Après cela, nous aurons la paix, peut-être la paix des morts. Vous savez, la paix des cimetières.
I was a young press attaché to General Leclerc, and I was able to get posted from Saigon to Phnom Penh. We were received by the young King Sihanouk, who must have been 18 at the time, just a kid, and he really seemed like a sort of toy king. He was very nice and quite amusing. I think he had a saxophone in his hand when he received us. He was living in a very, very French environment.
Norodom Sihanouk's first life started out ever so well. Chosen to be king of Cambodia by the French at the age of 18, he was inexperienced and immature, more interested in conquering women than in challenging the colonial rulers.
Cambodia was not an important place to the French. It was a small element of their Indo-Chinese adventure. French control wasn't very systematic and over people's daily lives. The taxes were quite high, but taxes had always been high. The French charged took a lot of money out of the Cambodians. They certainly didn't want to have a king in Cambodia who would in any way stand up to them. So they felt that they had a very flexible young man who could serve French interests. Sihanouk learned a good deal in the first 6 or 7 years of his reign, under French guidance, under French advice. He learned that if a king traveled around the country, he could call in an enormous fund of adulation and praise, and people thought he was a deity in those days. People fell on the ground when he came by. And I think this probably entered his head that there were elements of being king of Cambodia which were connected with absolute power.
Led by the Vietnamese communist leader Ho Chi Minh, the French Indochina War ignited the struggle for independence throughout Southeast Asia. Sihanouk, who had begun to hone his political skills, would gradually undermine the control of the colonial authorities by playing on France's fear that communism would start to spread in the wake of the Vietnamese.
He sort of looked around, it would be as if, you know, this independence thing is a winner. The French are going to leave Indochina, so why shouldn't he take command of this independence feelings? The puppet started to walk on his own feet, and it was the French didn't know quite what to do with that because they thought he was always going to do what they had in mind.
To the surprise of the French, who had considered him just a young playboy, Sihanouk made his first big political move when he abruptly left Phnom Penh for Angkor and set off on a global crusade for the independence of Cambodia. Everywhere he went, he proclaimed his desire to make France give in. In October 1953, his crusade finally brought him to Paris.
Sihanouk did say to one of them, he said, give me independence and I'll rent the country to you for 100 years. We want independence. I'm going to take control of this movement. You better give me some, because he said this on some game, I can't control my people.
Bogged down by its war in Vietnam, France finally granted Cambodia its independence. Sihanouk, who had earned himself the proud title of the Father of Independence, returned to Phnom Penh in triumph.
Moi-même, j'ai obtenu de la France cette indépendance pour mon pays, pacifiquement, mais je dois avouer que mon succès a été obtenu grâce à la guerre que menait contre le colonialisme français le peuple vietnamien au Vietnam. J'en ai profité.
No, the boyish youth I had met a few years earlier had become a man. And not only that, a politician.
At the Bandung Conference, the Third World's most eminent leaders would introduce Sihanouk to the virtues of neutrality and anti-Americanism. Invited to the summit of non-aligned nations, Cambodia became visible, for the first time, on the world map.
He's courted in a funny way by Zhou Enlai, by Nehru, by Sukarno, by these big heroes of the anti-colonial struggle. And they're having meals with him and smiling at him and telling him he's important. And of course, he won't stop talking because he keeps saying, I'm important.
In Bandung, the garrulous Sihanouk would make friends with the placid Zhou Enlai. And for Cambodia, another surprise political move was in store.
Abdicating in order to govern, that's really quite astonishing. In fact, it's rather admirable. A constitutional monarch who says, I'm going to abdicate in order to be able to run my country, because as a constitutional king, I'm not allowed to govern directly.
Sihanouk persuaded his father, Suramarit, to replace him as king while he stepped down to become Citizen Sihanouk. A prince without a crown, he would nevertheless rule undivided in the political arena.
At that time, he thought getting involved in politics was a logical move. It was necessary in order for him to preserve everything that had been gained by independence. And in a way, it was the Cambodian situation itself that forced him to make that decision.
During the elections in October 1955, Sihanouk implemented a campaign of intimidation and terror against the opposition. Sangkum, his new party, won all the seats in the National Assembly and became the only party in Cambodia. In 2 years, Citizen Sihanouk had established his absolute authority over France's former colony. This was the beginning of the Golden Age. Neutral and at peace with its neighbors, the country developed economically. Neutrality for Sihanouk meant refusing the United States military umbrella, but avidly accepting the millions of dollars handed out by the vice president of that very same America, Richard Nixon.
Notre neutralité, elle n'est pas idéologique. Elle est conçue en tenant compte de l'équilibre des deux blocs antagonistes dans cette région où nous sommes. Supposons que, avec les pressions que nous avons connues, nous nous alignons sur le bloc occidental. Il est certain qu'à l'heure actuelle, vous ne trouveriez pas le Cambodge dans cet état de grâce qui vous a plu, n'est-ce pas, de me signaler.
Sihanouk was very clever at taking advantage of the rivalries between the major powers. He played China against the United States or against the USSR, and in doing so, he received financial support from everyone. So the country was developing. The roads were quite good almost everywhere except for a few little sections. Schools and universities were springing up. Industries were developing. The Kampong Som port was created by France, for example. The road from Phnom Penh to the port was built by the U.S., the Khmer Soviet hospital by the USSR, and several factories were given to Cambodia by the Chinese.
Nous sommes particulièrement reconnaissants à la Chine populaire de nous avoir donné surtout des usines, de nous aider surtout à augmenter notre production. C'est ça, la production agricole, la production industrielle, c'est ça qui fait l'indépendance d'un pays.
It gave Cambodia a sense of pride. For the first time, we had the feeling that there were people taking care of us, taking care of the country, and the Cambodian people were very happy.
Sihanouk showered his people with speeches about Cambodia's grandeur. When his father died in 1960, he became head of state and seemed to have found the magic formula: popularity, neutrality, and pride.
He didn't want to wake up the ordinary Khmer because I think he knew that on $200 a year, you don't have much money. It's just not a good situation for the people who adored him.
For the common people, Sihanouk was a god. Indeed, he was called Divine Sihanouk. As far as the so-called intelligentsia was concerned, however, he was ruthless. Those who opposed him were eliminated.
In present-day Cambodia, things have not changed much for those who oppose the government in power. They still have a hard time being heard. That's what Sam Rainsy must have thought during the legislative elections held in 2008. The son of Sam Sari, who was one of Sihanouk's closest aides, Sam Rainsy and his father have both suffered from the government's ire. In 1997, Rainsy was the victim of a terrorist attack. In 1959, his father, accused of treason and hunted down by Sihanouk's police, was forced into exile.
Sihanouk put my mother in prison for a year because he suspected my father of planning a coup d'etat. Sihanouk had set up what he called popular audiences. And if you had a request, you could ask to see him during these sessions. I was authorized to attend one of them, along with my brothers and sisters, and we begged Sihanouk to please release our mother. We groveled before the prince. We begged for mercy, for forgiveness, for pity, for whatever. It didn't matter.
Quelquefois, nous avons été très durs, mais pas à l'égard du peuple, mais à l'égard des agents cambodgiens traîtres. Alors contre cela, nous sommes durs. Pourquoi? Parce que c'est notre peuple qui est dur contre cela, pour pouvoir préserver notre indépendance et notre liberté et notre intégrité territoriale. Car ceux-là sont chargés de travailler pour l'expansionnisme de nos voisins et pour l'alignement du Cambodge sur les États-Unis d'Amérique. Alors nous tenons à rester neutres et nous ne voulons pas nous embarquer dans la galère des Américains. C'est pourquoi nous sommes très durs contre ces gens-là. Nous en avons fusillé pas mal. Sur un plateau de leur balance, ils mettent leur vie. Et sur l'autre plateau, les dollars que leur donnent les Américains. Alors les dollars ne pèsent pas lourd devant la mort qui les attend ici, au Cambodge.
The increasingly powerful presence of the U.S. Army in South Vietnam would lead Sihanouk to make irreversible decisions that were, in his opinion, necessary to maintain peace in Cambodia. Believing that the North Vietnamese communists would prevail, Sihanouk terminated the U.S. financial aid, even though it represented 15% of the Cambodian budget. In the eyes of the West, he became a communist. Slowly but surely, Cambodia's economy began to crumble.
C'est un virage à gauche, c'est entendu, mais en ce qui concerne notre régime intérieur, en ce qui concerne notre politique extérieure, nous tâcherons de rester absolument neutres.
But the Vietnam War started spilling over the border into Cambodia. This led Sihanouk to secretly rent out a part of his territory to the North Vietnamese. In return, they promised to respect the territorial integrity of his country.
In order to maintain peace in Cambodia, we allowed the North Vietnamese to move into a small area of Cambodian territory in the northwest. But little by little, they began to settle in until our armed forces no longer controlled that entire zone.
Then one morning I saw an overturned truck. I had been in the army, and so I was familiar with weapons, and I saw it was full of AK-47s, Chinese assault rifles.
Convinced that the communists would win the war, Sihanouk authorized the Chinese and the Russians to use the port of Sihanoukville to deliver arms and ammunition to the North Vietnamese. For a long time, he would deny the existence of these deals.
Je vous assure que nous n'avons accordé au Vietcong ou au Viet Minh aucune aide militaire ou logistique sous quelque forme que ce soit.
The Cambodian army took advantage of the arms shipments and seized 10% of the supplies that were unloaded. That was one way to make up for the loss of the American aid.
Things got worse after 1965, and the people were miserable. I didn't realize it because I had just arrived in Cambodia, and the Cambodians are people who smile all the time, and so I thought this meant they were happy. But corruption was real. There was almost no medical care of any kind out in the rural area where I was. Sihanouk would open clinics stocked with medicines with doctors in white coats, and as soon as he left, everything would be taken away to open up another clinic somewhere else. The people were left with nothing at all.
Since his meeting with Zhou Enlai, China had become a cornerstone of Sihanouk's neutralist policy. And the Chinese believed that the prince they had invited to Beijing for a fabulous visit was an advocate of their cause.
I remember an interview he gave me in Le Monde in which he said, "When China comes on stage, it's like Maria Callas."
China, on the threshold of its Cultural Revolution, was seeking to extend its political influence. Sihanouk was seeking money. And because of the lavish treatment he received, he believed in the generosity of the Chinese. The Chinese, on the other hand, thought that the trip they were offering him had won the prince over to the virtues of Maoism, a misunderstanding that would last until the advent of the Khmer Rouge 10 years later. The Chinese propaganda machine immediately besieged Cambodia. Thousands of little red books were sent to the universities. The Cultural Revolution was now in full swing, and the Cambodian communists, who had been hiding out in the jungle since 1963, along with their leader, a certain Pol Pot, were invited to Beijing. Sihanouk started to panic.
La Chine inonde le Cambodge de propagande et d'activités subversives. Le communisme asiatique, tout d'abord, ne pouvait pas coexister éternellement avec un Cambodge monarchiste, nationaliste et socialiste bouddhique. Et je dois la remercier de s'en prendre trop tôt à mon régime, à notre régime national, alors qu'il est encore très fort, très sûr du soutien populaire, très capable de s'opposer à la maoïsation du Cambodge.
When in real trouble, call your friend. Now, who's my friend in this situation? De Gaulle's the only one. You can't call on a communist friend because the war is going on next door. America's gone. Neighbors are hopeless. So De Gaulle, fine.
In September 1966, Sihanouk went all out to offer his idol, French President de Gaulle, a grandiose reception in the best Khmer style.
Everyone in Cambodia knew de Gaulle. They had forged a very personal, very intimate relationship with General de Gaulle, whom they called Lok Ta, which in Cambodian means grandfather, that is, an old man with wisdom and experience.
There were about 30,000 school children who had been rehearsing for 3 or 4 months with cards that displayed "Long live the friendship between France and Cambodia," with images of Cambodia and France. And then, without any notes, de Gaulle gave a visionary speech that was so lucid, so perfectly exact on what was going to happen throughout Indochina in the future.
Il n'y a aucune chambre pour que les peuples de l'Asie se soumettent à la loi d'un étranger venu de l'autre rive du Pacifique.
I had seen the Cambodians the day before, and it was my understanding that they had asked de Gaulle not to go too far. They didn't want to irritate the Americans too much at that time.
Out of this visit, which gave de Gaulle the opportunity to tell off the Americans, Sihanouk got nothing. De Gaulle came with very little aid in his pockets. Sihanouk, mesmerized by the French president's visit, saw his political influence in Cambodia begin to wane. General Lon Nol, a pro-American conservative, became prime minister. Lon Nol allowed the army to extort rural farmers who had chosen to sell their rice to the North Vietnamese. Encouraged by Pol Pot's communist guerrillas, the peasants revolted. For Sihanouk, this was a supreme affront. The rebellion was bloodily repressed. Over 10,000 peasants around Samlat were massacred. In one of his diatribes, Sihanouk denounced the existence of those Khmer Rouge.
He said Krom. In Cambodian, that means rouge, or red, because the color of those on the left was red, and on the right blue. All of that is very, very Western. It also comes from reading the international press.
Disappointed by France, fearful of the Chinese, and under pressure from right-wing conservatives, Sihanouk had no choice but to renew ties with the United States. His reception of President Kennedy's widow, Jackie, showed he welcomed relations with the Americans once again. But his illusion of a peaceful Cambodia was fading away.
At that point, he changed sides, and he asked the American army to bomb the sanctuaries along the border. On the radio, of course, he ranted and raved against the U.S. Army that was bombing Cambodia. But the fact was, he was the one who had given the order.
Sihanouk now found himself in a very uncomfortable position. He was secretly authorizing the Americans to bomb the North Vietnamese bases that he had secretly authorized on his soil.
On the one hand, we were fed up with the insolence of the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, who had begun extracting taxes from our peasants on the border. On the other, there were extravagant expenditures for official receptions that, given the austerity of the situation, we couldn't really afford. Everyone in the capital was grumbling.
The overall feeling was that everything was going to fall apart one day or another. It wasn't necessarily because of his regime or anything else, but the tensions were such that it was clear that it couldn't last forever.
Sihanouk's neutrality had always been considered an impediment by the Americans. They wanted to have free rein in order to pull Cambodia into the war. Lon Nol, however, hesitated to overthrow the prince. Under pressure, Sihanouk handed all of his power over to him, but it was too late.
In December 1969, I was in Phnom Penh, and I was told at the French embassy, Sihanouk's finished. He's a communist, there's going to be a coup d'etat, and he'll be out.
When Sihanouk left Phnom Penh for the south of France, he was still head of state. He was sure the Cambodians would recall him very soon, as they always had.
No one had mentioned any trip to France by Prince Sihanouk, so I was a little surprised. But I knew that he regularly came to Grasse to consult Dr. Pathé because of his weight problems.
Stuck in his villa in Mougins, Sihanouk waited.
I was in Mougins when I saw Marshal Lon Nol, and I have to say I was quite surprised to see him. Of course, Lon Nol was considered to be Sihanouk's accomplice. But still, I wondered why he had left Cambodia.
What did Lon Nol actually say to Sihanouk? That he had become an obstacle? He had taken so much luggage with him when he left Cambodia, he could certainly consider living in France. As for Phnom Penh, he could kiss it goodbye. And to put the final nail in his political coffin, Lon Nol organized a raid on the Vietnamese communist embassies by students who were completely manipulated on March 12, 1970.
The private secretary pointed toward the National Assembly and said to me, "Listen, madam, listen to what they're doing. They're up to something." I said, "No, they wouldn't dare. They wouldn't dare, not in his absence."
On March 18, 1970, Lon Nol was ready to oust Sihanouk. But the planned coup d'etat had to have all the trappings of legality. The members of parliament were summoned to the National Assembly for an emergency session.
My mother was with us when she received a phone call. It was around 10 o'clock in the morning, I think. "You have to come. There's a very, very important meeting." When she arrived, she was quite shocked to see soldiers in arms guarding the National Assembly. She had never seen anything like it. Some parliament members came over to her and said, "Do you want to see your husband, your children, and your grandchildren again?" Mother said, "What kind of question is that? Of course I want to see my husband, my children, and my grandchildren again." "Then do as you're told." When she came back home later on, she said, "Oh my goodness, I had to vote." "Vote for what?" "Vote for the deposition of the prince."
Sihanouk was no longer the head of state of Cambodia. He would soon be sentenced to death. The monarchy was abolished, a republic was established, and Lon Nol would allow the United States to drag Cambodia into the Vietnam War.
He who was God incarnate, the fact that his children and grandchildren could depose him, that was a cosmic revolution.
Sihanouk, or the victim of inevitable choices. In 1963, he consented to the Vietnamese incursions in order to keep the peace. Did he have a choice? Then he broke off relations with the Americans who wanted to drag him into the war. Did he have a choice? When he turned to Maoist China for money, taking the risk that China would side with the Khmer Rouge over him, did he have a choice? When he turned to France, and then in the end turned back to the United States, did he have a choice? After the coup d'etat, Sihanouk took refuge in Beijing. Who else but the Khmer Rouge, backed by the Chinese, to restore him to power in Phnom Penh? In fact, he signed a pact with the devil, but did he have any choice? 5 days after arriving in Beijing, Sihanouk made an appeal over the radio, exhorting his fellow Cambodians to join the Khmer Rouge and combat Lon Nol and his American allies. That was the beginning of the Civil War.
They played the cassette of Sihanouk asking the Khmer people to enter the Maquis, the resistance movement, in order to overthrow the fascist Lon Nol. They wore Sihanouk's badge in their buttonhole. I saw it with my own eyes. And they told the people, "We've come to restore the king."
Sihanouk, overcome by hatred for Lon Nol and by the desire for vengeance, became one of the most fervent defenders of communism in Beijing. He presided over a puppet government, and the Khmer Rouge kept a close eye on him all of the time.
He was very wary of the Khmer Rouge. His relations with the Khmer Rouge were quite complicated. I remember once my wife and I were invited to a dinner party in his residence in Beijing. Ieng Sari, one of the Khmer Rouge leaders, was there, and Sihanouk said to my wife and me in a voice that was loud and clear, "That man's name is Ieng Sari. He's my eye from Moscow." His relationship with the Khmer Rouge was not conflictual, it was more like a competition.
En compétition avec les Khmer Rouge.
In April 1973, Sihanouk was allowed to visit the zones that the communist resistance movement had liberated in Cambodia. He never said a word about what he saw there. But did Sihanouk even recognize his own people? By entering the strange world of the Khmer Rouge, Sihanouk was forever entering a conspiracy of silence. All of the communist leaders were there to greet him, the discreet Pol Pot and his former minister, the elegant Coup Sampan.
He's terrified, but he's going through the motions of the protocol. I mean, he's like you know, Louis says. He knows these are really dangerous people, but he's got to be very polite, and he doesn't know what lies in wait. These people make him nervous because he doesn't understand them, and they understand him only enough to despise him. They say that what they know about him they despise, and he can't understand them at all. He can't understand the darkness and the class warfare, the clothing, the repression, the Puritanism, none of that. It makes no sense. It doesn't make any sense to him. As he thought about Pol Pot, he was quite envious of his ability to pull people toward absolute loyalty and absolute religion. To die for Pol Pot, to die for Sihanouk made no sense to Sihanouk. Really, he was more of a narcissist than a power-hungry person. He couldn't imagine somebody dying for him.
Après la guerre, je verrai si l'atmosphère n'est pas bonne entre nous. Je quitte tout de suite mes fonctions de chef d'État. Je ne les gênerai pas, les communistes. Je ne leur donnerai pas le temps de me décapiter.
Un porte-drapeau.
He was a standard bearer, a torch bearer, a banner that enabled the Khmer Rouge to rally the people around them.
La population.
Without the prince, the Khmer Rouge were nothing, you know. Absolutely nothing.
From 1970 to 1973, the U.S. Air Force dropped 100,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia, ravaging the country, yet merely slowing down the Khmer Rouge's ineluctable march to power. A few months before the fall of Phnom Penh, the first reports of the Khmer Rouge's activities in their so-called liberated zones were received by the American ambassador in Cambodia.
The Washington view of the Khmer Rouge was what we wrote. And what we wrote, they're a bunch of killers, a bunch of brutal people we had examples. We're sending constantly messages from our embassy and seeing what they have done. We, the diplomats, whether they were French, whether they were Americans, whether they were Russians, we wrote the truth. We saw what was going on.
Did you still have a relationship with Sihanouk at that time? Were you writing to each other?
Yes, we were.
Even as an ambassador to
Yes,
through
Mr. Etienne Manac. A great deal. He was in Beijing, ambassador, the French ambassador.
What was the content of your exchanges?
Please help us find a quote controlled solution to the problems.
Did you inform him of what you knew about the Khmer Rouge, what they were doing
That wasn't my job to do. Come on.
Je parle non seulement au nom de Sihanouk, mais au nom de toute la résistance khmère, c'est-à-dire des Khmer Rouges qui mènent la lutte à l'intérieur. Ils m'ont demandé de dire au monde entier que jamais nous ne négocierions ou nous réconcilierions avec les gens de Phnom Penh. Nous continuerons la lutte armée jusqu'à ce que l'opportunité nous soit offerte, la possibilité nous soit offerte de prendre Phnom Penh.
In early April 1975, the Khmer Rouge began bombing the city of Phnom Penh daily. 2 million Cambodians had taken refuge there, fleeing the U.S. air raids and the communist guerrillas.
The Cambodian people, myself included, thought that a Khmer Rouge victory meant victory for Sihanouk, because we believed that it was Sihanouk who was leading the Khmer Rouge movement. And so we believed that their victory would mean a return to peace, a return to the way things were before the Republic.
On April 17, 1975, the Khmer Rouge took Phnom Penh. The new regime, as extremist as it was utopian, spread a blanket of horror over Cambodia for the next 4 years. They evacuated the cities, forcing millions of people to take to the road, separating families, eliminating the weak and the educated. They transformed the rice fields into cooperatives and the cooperatives into concentration camps. They forced the population to build pharaonic irrigation systems that killed huge numbers in the process. They implemented the plan designed by brother number 1, Pol Pot, during the 12 years he had spent deep in the jungle. Sihanouk hesitated for 3 months until Mao Zedong finally made him return to Phnom Penh.
On the evening before he left, the prince and my father were together in the kitchen, and the prince said, "Am I making the right decision to go home?" And my father replied, "Do you want me to be honest with you?" And the prince said, "Yes." So my father said, "I don't know if it's the right decision or not, but you'll be used and then discarded." The prince said, "I know, you're right. Then why are you returning home?" He replied, "Well, I promised I would return. It's my destiny. I have to go home."
Sihanouk knew that once the Khmer Rouge were in power, they would, as he himself said, spit him out like a cherry stone. After living with them for 5 years, he knew what they had in store for Cambodia. But because of the pact he had made with them and his desire for power, he remained silent. Sihanouk returned to a capital emptied of its inhabitants and was proclaimed head of state. The masquerade lasted no more than a few weeks. 3 months after returning to Cambodia, Sihanouk disappeared.
Entre 76 et 79, on me promenait de temps à autre dans des usines et à la campagne, surtout dans des coopératives. Mon peuple, au lieu de me reprocher d'être avec les Khmer Rouges, se sentait réconforté par ma présence. Il se disait, le prince aurait pu être à Pékin dans son palais, aurait pu être à Paris, mais il a préféré être prisonnier de Pol Pot avec nous. Et c'est ce que le peuple m'a toujours dit. Et je sentais que j'étais utile à mon peuple.
While he was under house arrest and cut off from the rest of the world, the only distraction that the gourmet-loving prince had was to copy recipes or learn German from an old Berlitz handbook. In the middle of his notes, the radio station frequencies he was able to pick up inside his palace prison in Phnom Penh.
Je suivais très attentivement ce qu'on disait, ce que les réfugiés disaient, ce que les autres disaient par l'intermédiaire de mon appareil de radio. Mais je n'étais pas au courant de ces massacres.
Before the prince left, he made it clear that no one was to come with him. So when his 2 sons arrived, he said, "Why are you here? I told you not to come." His sons showed him a telegram that was signed by the prince. He said, "I never sent that telegram."
J'ai perdu 3 filles, 2 fils, 2 gendres, 14 petits-enfants. Alors, qu'on comprenne bien pourquoi je suis resté au Cambodge. Je suis resté par solidarité avec mon peuple. Et j'ai des enfants. J'ai perdu mes enfants. Est-ce que quelqu'un peut dire qu'il a souffert autant que moi?
On January 7, 1979, after a 12-day blitzkrieg, the Vietnamese toppled the Khmer Rouge regime and entered Phnom Penh in triumph. The Vietnamese and the Cambodians had been fighting it out for over a year. The Khmer Rouge's Maoist-inspired Democratic Kampuchea became the People's Republic of Kampuchea, controlled by the Vietnamese. The Cambodian people, however, could not have cared less about these political subtleties. All they knew was that someone was finally opening the gates of hell. Although it is difficult today to determine the actual number of victims, it is estimated that over 1.5 million people died during the 4 years of Pol Pot's rule, from starvation, exhaustion, disease, torture, and execution.
I have friends who told me they were going to be executed. And then that night, the Vietnamese arrived. And so thanks to the Vietnamese, they were saved. And it's true, most of the people welcomed the Vietnamese as their liberators. In the weeks and months after the Vietnamese troops took over, life in Cambodia went back to being a little more normal.
3 unreal years of confinement had not prepared Norodom Sihanouk to the events that unfolded the day before the Vietnamese arrived. Received by Pol Pot, called Your Majesty, he was told he would be leaving for Beijing with his remaining family. After that, he would go to the United Nations and denounce the Vietnamese invasion. Pol Pot handed him a new passport and his itinerary. They would never see each other again. When he arrived in Beijing, he was greeted by China's new leader, Deng Xiaoping. All along, China had unfailingly supported the Khmer Rouge and, at the same time, continued to protect Sihanouk, a Sihanouk that the world had thought was dead.
I'd been waiting for that telephone call. That night, I was sleeping, and I heard the phone ring, and I knew it was him. There are no words to express how I felt. After 3 years without any news, or only bad news, and then suddenly, it's like waking up from a bad dream.
He went from his prison in Phnom Penh to a 5-star hotel to defend the regime that could very well have executed him 2 days earlier.
Just as he had promised Pol Pot, Sihanouk went to New York. In the first speech he made as a free man, he demanded and obtained the support of the international community for the Khmer Rouge regime. He made no mention at all of the atrocities suffered by the Cambodian people.
Je me suis allié au Khmer Rouge, qui à cette époque-là n'était pas connu comme étant des amateurs de génocide. Personne ne pouvait imaginer qu'ils fussent des gens capables de commettre de telles horreurs, de tels crimes. Personne. Celui qui m'accuse aujourd'hui, est-ce que celui-là, n'est-ce pas, il savait ce qu'étaient les Khmer Rouges? On savait que Boris Karloff pouvait incarner les monstres, Frankenstein, etc., mais on ne savait pas que M. Pol Pot était un monstre. On ne savait pas que M. Ieng Sary était un monstre.
When Sihanouk arrived in Pyongyang, North Korea, he was feeling very depressed. For the first time in a long time, he had said no. No to China, who wanted him at all costs to renew his alliance with the Khmer Rouge. Sihanouk was worn out, and his friend, the Stalinian dictator Kim Il-sung, offered him some peace and quiet.
When I met him, he was living in the palace that Kim Il-sung had built for him, a huge Korean-style palace with 60 rooms and everything else. The setting was right out of the movies. Up in the mountains with a beautiful lake. It was gorgeous in the summer. And in the winter, it reminded you of Switzerland, completely surrounded by snow. It was beautiful.
Je suis hors jeu. Je compte sur mon ami, mon meilleur ami, le seul que j'ai au monde, le président Kim Il-sung de la République populaire démocratique de Corée, pour m'accueillir chez lui jusqu'à ma mort. Je compte mourir en Corée, qui est ma deuxième patrie. Je resterai toute ma vie très attaché au Cambodge, mais j'ai perdu l'espoir de retourner chez moi.
Times had changed. There was nowhere he could take refuge anymore. No one to serve him anymore. He was living in seclusion up in Korea.
The Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia had created an unprecedented exodus of Cambodians fleeing starvation and the fear of war. 300,000 refugees amassed on the Cambodian-Thai border, where numerous camps were set up.
A certain number of groups were soon trying to recruit among these refugees, and especially the Khmer Rouge there that had regrouped on the border.
With the active support of the Chinese and the tacit agreement of the Americans, the Khmer Rouge began to reorganize and rearm in order to combat the Vietnamese occupiers. As in the past, Pol Pot remained in the shadows, and Khieu Samphan became the respectable facade of the communist movement. At the same time, Son Sann, one of Sihanouk's former prime ministers, formed another insurgent group financed by right-wing members of the Cambodian diaspora. After a 2-year absence, Sihanouk was no longer able to stay out of the picture, and in 1981, he decided to start his own resistance group, the Phun Sin Pek.
The first thing he did was to visit a refugee camp. There were maybe 40 or 50,000 people there, and when he arrived, it started raining. I remember the people shouting with joy, saying, "Samdech has returned. Everything will be all right." And in fact, look, it's raining. Rain is a sign of abundance because it enables the rice to grow.
Sihanouk was back in the limelight. He soon allied himself with Son Sann's group and with Khieu Samphan's Khmer Rouge, the most effective armed movement against the Vietnamese enemy.
You had the DK, which had condemned Lon Nol to death. You had Lon Nol faction, which is becoming the BLDP, the Son Sann. They had condemned Sihanouk to death. Sihanouk had condemned everybody else to death. Each one of them has condemned their predecessor to death. So how can you get a coalition? I think Sihanouk sees this conflicts and these people are just personal ambitions and messing around, and he sees maybe the thing to do is to negotiate with Hun Sen. Hun
Sen, the new strongman in Cambodia, was a former Khmer Rouge who had fled the bloody regime in 1977 and whom the Vietnamese had brought back with them and installed at the head of the country. Hun Sen was aware that he would soon have to face the armed rebels on the border by himself. He too came to the conclusion that peace was the only solution.
Everyone was tired of war and violence, and everyone believed that the only way to bring peace back was a political settlement. So we were ready to try anything, especially dialogue, but we didn't know exactly how to do it, and I think Sihanouk himself didn't really know what strategy to use.
In 1987, under pressure from the USSR, the Vietnamese withdrew from Cambodia. Colonization was becoming a costly operation. Once again, the bid for peace was in the hands of Hun Sen, who had become prime minister, and Sihanouk, who was still in exile and secretly hoping to become president of Cambodia. On December 2nd, 1987, the elderly Sihanouk and the young Hun Sen met for the first time. This meeting was the beginning of a diplomatic power struggle in which everyone discreetly held their nose so as not to smell the lingering odor of the Khmer Rouge.
Sihanouk underestimated his adversaries. He said, "The person who is able to get the better of Sihanouk hasn't been born yet."
Moi, je n'accepterai pas d'élection tant qu'il y a le Cambodien populaire.
Hun Sen had been born almost 50 years ago, a good 40 years before at the time. And in the end, Hun Sen got the better of Sihanouk. Sihanouk had underestimated Hun Sen.
In 1991, the Cambodian peace agreements were signed. After 12 years in exile, Sihanouk returned home at last to Phnom Penh, this time in triumph. Yet, though he fought to bring peace back to his country, he would do nothing to recognize the suffering of his people, the people whom he says he loves so dearly. Sihanouk is lucky. Young Cambodians do not know their history. Back in his palace, his dream of being president soon vanished. His son Ranarid and his rival Hun Sen agreed to offer him a throne stripped of any power. The Republic of Cambodia became the Kingdom of Cambodia once again, and Sihanouk, King Sihanouk. Thus began his 9th life. Not liable, not at fault, the king would forever remain silent.
Hãy subscribe cho kênh Ghiền Mì Gõ để không bỏ lỡ